Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and welcome back. What's up, guys? How's it going? In a week where Trump placed a ban on international students and Kanye decided he was running for president, a lot has been going on in my head. But I wanted to bring some of the movies that I watched this week to light for you guys. Starting with probably the worst movie I've ever seen, which is just the cherry on top for this week. Netflix released a new movie starring Nasim Pedrad called Desperados, and we're going to start by me completely tearing that apart because it's so bad. It's so bad. We'll then move on to discuss Dunkirk, which is a movie that I spoke about a little bit last time when I was talking about myself and sort of my history with film. Dunkirk is one of the movies that really made me want to do film seriously, and I feel like it's probably best if I talk about it in a little more detail. I then want to talk about a movie that I just watched recently after a long time, Alice in Wonderland, the original 1951 Disney animation. And we'll close off today by talking about my 5 favorite comedy movies on Netflix. So let's get into it. Alright, so this week I watched, and the better way of describing it is I suffered through 100 and I don't know how many minutes of a movie called Desperados, which is one of Netflix's latest. So now Desperados is a movie about this neurotic Angelino named Wesley, played by Nasim Pedrad. You might know her from Brooklyn Nine-Nine or Saturday Night Live, where she did some really great impressions of Kim Kardashian. She was also in New Girl, I believe, for like a guest recurring role. She is this out-of-work, foul-mouthed, or at least when it suits the character to be foul-mouthed, guidance counselor in this desperate rush to fix her life, by finding the perfect guy, catching up to her friends, and launching into a new job for which she's been hunting for the entire year. Despite the fact that she has no job and has had no job for the last year, which the movie, makes an effort to tell you with all these random shots of bills and calls from her mom that tell her to get a job. She lives in Echo Park with seemingly unlimited resources, as we'll get into in a bit, but also based off of her apartment, in typical Friends fashion. She has 2 best friends, Kaylee, played by Sarah Burns, who is this wacky, hippie type of person, and Brooke, played by Anna Camp, who is the classy version of the friend. Now, in the film, Wes goes from blind date to blind date, tries to figure out how to freeze her eggs, mourns over dead birds, and takes pride in being not like other girls. You know, she defines herself as an acquired taste. But in reality, she's just immature and doesn't think through situations and always says the wrong thing. Now, for instance, in the beginning, we're introduced to her in this job interview for a Catholic school. And, you know, in order to show that she's different and, you know, quirky, she starts blabbing to a nun about how she has no experience as a guidance counselor and how masturbation is important. Well, you know, and she has to do this because she's just adorable and she's #quirky, and she'd rather sabotage another job interview for no reason because clearly she's doing fine. Now, also because of, you know, her inability to control herself and her #quirky nature, she ruins a blind date with Lamorne Morris's character, Sean. Now, you might remember the pairing of Nasim Pedrad and Lamorne Morris from New Girl, where they play Winston and Ali, the very, very great chemistry-having couple. But, you know, she also messes Wesley in this film. Nasim Pedrad's character Wesley messes up her chances with Lamorne Morris's Sean, even though he's the only character in this film that sort of resembles a real human being. But now, here comes her knight in shining armor, played by Robbie Amell. Jared saves Wesley after she falls down and hits her head. You know, he's the sort of inciting incident that forces our heroine, who's completely undateable, to suddenly decide to become a completely different person, because he's the perfect man, you know, he's rich, he's handsome, he has his own duvet covers. So she decides to become the grown-up, who doesn't say the first thing that comes to her mind. Can we get a round of applause, finally? But, unfortunately, after not hearing from Jared for 5 days, after a beautiful month together and some great sex, Wesley, Kaylee, and Brooke decide to dig into their #crackhead energy, get drunk, and write the most scathing email that refers to Jared's dead dad way too much. Moments later, after sending this email, she finds out, unfortunately, that Jared wasn't ghosting her. Jared just got into a terrible car accident in Cabo and was in a coma for the last 3 days. Now, our heroine Wesley is stuck. And this is where the film begins. She decides, in a drunken, haze, I assume, to go to Mexico, break into his hotel room, and delete the email from existence. There was so much potential for this film to be, about Wesley discovering that she doesn't need to pretend to be someone else. She doesn't need to pretend to hate junk food and like bubble soccer in order to have this perfect man. But no, the writer Ellen Rappaport chose to go down this route. This extension of a bit from the movie The Intern that worked as like a 5-minute bit rather than an actual 105-minute film. And, from here, Wesley tries and fails to break into Jared's room. She develops a connection with Sean again, who just happens to be in Cabo at the same time. Then in her bids to, figure out how to get the laptop from Jared's room, she gets banned from the hotel and then deepens her bond with Sean in Mexican prison. Then she doubles down on her #crackhead energy in deleting the email and loses her friends, who then suddenly go to a Gwyneth Paltrow goop rip-off shaman. The only thing that the film was self-aware about. the only thing. She then continues to develop her relationship with Sean again as they abandon their chase for Jared once he leaves from the hospital in 2 vans, by the way, for no reason. And after swerving from a goat, end up at a random quinceañera. She then finally gets to the airport, tells Jared the truth after, for some reason, knocking him out with multiple Percocets. Then she loses her friends. She gets a job, gets her life together by being her #quirky self, and then redeems her friendships by saving a cat that looks like Hitler, and then finally getting together with Sean. Now, when you look at other films that this was trying to emulate, like The Bridesmaids or Girls Trip, you realize that all of those films have complex explorations of each character. But the reason every scene in this film felt forced is because there's no real characters with no real motivations. The secondary characters in this film are only there to drive the plot and make decisions for Wes, and Wes has no discernible motivation beyond the superficial one of preserving her pristine image for a man she barely knows. Desperados has no interest in showing these women's real and relatable struggles and inner worlds. There's no way that we can understand, for example, why suddenly Kaylee and Brooke will turn on Wes because she's being selfish, despite the fact that the self-serving reasons of this trip have been abundantly clear from the beginning. There's a point at which, and I like to think that this line sort of describes the film as a whole. Anna Camp's character, Brooke, says to Wes, "This pitch is horrible, but I love you and I want to see you happy." I feel like that's what Netflix is doing with this film. Someone brought it to them and they said, "This pitch sucks, but I love you and I want to see your movie get made. I want to fulfill your dreams." There was so much in this film that just didn't make sense. You know what? In fact, I have a list of things that didn't make sense in this film, and I want to read those out to you. Okay, starting with number 1. How can she afford to go to Mexico if she hasn't had a job in a year? The film spends so much time establishing that she can't pay her bills. 2. If Sean says he's not adventurous, why did he take Wesley paddleboarding? Why did he take her in the first place? I thought he wasn't interested. And then, why does Jared need 2 vans to leave Mexico in the Mexican hospital? Why does he need one for the bags and one for himself? Then why did these vans split up? And then when Wesley and Sean decide to follow the van with the bags so that Wesley can fulfill what she wants to do, why do they end up at a quinceañera and decide that they can spend the evening there eating crickets, dancing, and watching the sun down? And why does it take all of that time that Wes and Sean take to get into a car accident, attend a quinceañera, befriend the entire family, and then get into the van with all of Jared's stuff for Jared to get to the airport? And if Jared's stuff was in the van in the first place, then why didn't Wes just do why didn't she just do what she came down to Mexico to do? Why didn't she just delete the email on the van and ride because she had access to the laptop in the first place? And then how does she climb a tree in heels? That is probably my biggest question. How did she do that? How is it that Sean was able to say that he wasn't ready to get into something meaningful with Wes at the end, but then had a blind date with a woman who had a missing brother, and then 2 minutes later he's standing outside running after Wes saying that he's ready to get into a meaningful relationship with Wes? And finally, why did this movie suck so much? Alright, let's take a break there. Up next, we're going to talk about Dunkirk, and then stay tuned for Alice in Wonderland, and finally we'll close off today with my 5 favorite comedies on Netflix.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back. We just spoke about Desperados and why it's genuinely the most terrible movie I've seen come out this decade. Obviously, 7 months is not a long time, but this movie really sucks. Let's talk about Dunkirk. So for those of you who listened last week, you would have heard me mention Dunkirk as one of the reasons I'm studying film and want to go into the entertainment space. So I thought I'd talk a little bit more about Dunkirk and what it means to me in the movie itself. So Dunkirk is a 2017 feature film by Christopher Nolan. It talks about the harrowing realities of life as a soldier in World War II, and it takes place over 3 storylines, namely the mole, the sea, and the air. The film's 3 sequences feature little to no dialogue because Nolan wanted the atmosphere and tension to be built through music and cinematography. And it even eventually won the Academy Award for sound mixing and sound editing. The idea for Dunkirk came as on Christopher Nolan's 1990 boat trip with his wife Emma Thomas across the English Canal. They traveled the same route as the boats on the original Dunkirk evacuation. Now, Nolan wanted to originally improvise this entire film, but Emma Thomas, being his producer and partner in filmmaking, she persuaded him otherwise, and he finished his 76-page screenplay in 2015. Now, this was his shortest ever script, almost half of the size of his usual script, but it created a bulletproof and precise structure. The story is told in 3 perspectives: land, sea, and air, and Nolan's emphasis on character and visuals over dialogue and exposition sort of incorporate his traditional snowball effect. The research of this project came across as if he was creating a documentary, and his interest in this particular moment of history arose from the differences in the essence of the story of Dunkirk to the general Hollywood formula. Unlike most World War II movies, Dunkirk was not necessarily a victory. In fact, it was a humiliating defeat. But it still demanded a large-scale production to be told correctly. Nolan really emphasized the historical aspect of this, and he hired historian Joshua Levine as a historical consultant and accompanied Joshua Levine on many interviews with veterans. During the interviews, the pair heard a lot of stories about soldiers walking into the sea because of frustration and desperation. And because of this, there's a shot in the film that features one of these soldiers. Christopher Nolan worked with a lot of frequent collaborators. One of them was Hoyt van Hoytma, the director of photography for the film. Him and the production designer Nathan Crowley explored the beaches of Dunkirk while scouting locations and ultimately decided to film there, despite many logistical issues. In terms of production design, Nolan demanded a design aesthetic that would be completely authentic. Costume designer Jeffrey Kurland also decided to continue down this route, having the original heavy wool fabric of the British World War II uniforms being made from scratch for the entire cast and more than 1,000 extras. The boots for the soldiers were also made in a factory and at the production facility in England at Longcross Studios. The costume department aged these uniforms and boots with distinct sort of features of regiment, personality, and wear, all for the purpose of authenticity. His philosophy followed the idea that soldiers, since on the beach at Dunkirk they were also young and inexperienced, actors should be of the same sort of background, young and inexperienced. He also made it abundantly clear that the entire cast must be British, as to replicate the experience of these soldiers who usually didn't have contact with the enemy. No Germans were shown on screen. In late 2015, the casting directors announced that the cast would comprise of Kenneth Branagh, Tom Hardy, Mark Rylance, Fine Whitehead, Harry Styles, Jack Lowden, Aneurin Bernard. And finally, the main cast was rounded off with James D'Arcy, Cillian Murphy, Barry Keoghan, and Tom Glyn Carney. Michael Caine, who's another frequent collaborator of Christopher Nolan, also was cast in a spoken cameo as the voice of a pilot, Fortis leader. Principal photography began for Dunkirk in May 2016. That was so that the crew would avoid Bastille Day, potential logistical hiccups, and also to match the dates of the original evacuation. The film was shot as well in Weymouth and Swanage and Dorset, which is in England, and Point Vicente in Ranchos Palos Verdes, California. Filming in Dunkirk coincided with the actual evacuation, including the location, but the footage from the streets from the early parts were shot in a different town, because a lot of the buildings in Dunkirk had been destroyed in the war. Nolan also, as he usually does, wanted to minimize the use of CGI. Therefore, he created cardboard cutouts of soldiers, tanks, and other military apparatus to create the illusion of the size of the army. He also used real ships and planes from the time. Crowley and his Marine coordinator, Neil Andrea, reconditioned nearly 60 ships to shoot, including a retired French destroyer, 3 Netherlands Navy ships, and a Norwegian steamer. 20 of the actual little ships from the original Dunkirk evacuation were also used, captained by their owners. With regards to aircraft, a Russian craft was modified for the Spitfire, whereas 4 others were painted to look like the German Luftwaffe planes for combat scenes. Large-scale radio control aircraft were also used to film the crashing scenes in the English Channel. The real Spitfires were provided by the Imperial War Museum of Duxford, and its owner piloted the craft on the landing of the beach scene at the end of the film. So I mentioned that Nolan worked with a lot of frequent collaborators, and some of these were the editor, Lee Smith, and the scorer, Hans Zimmer. Now, Hans Zimmer has created a beautiful score that I listen to on a regular basis because I'm super weird like that, but also because it helps me get stuff done. In an interview, Nolan claimed that the hardest scenes to edit were the aerial sequences, comparing the process to a chess game. And limited CGI was used in traditional Nolan fashion to slightly better some scenes. But the film relied mostly on its realism for authenticity's sake. At least 15 versions of this film were cut to perfect Nolan's vision, made of, I think, 54 hours of raw footage from principal photography. A lot of the sound effects, especially for the Spitfires, were real explosions and looped recordings from the Imperial War Museum. The film was released in 2017 July in 70mm and 35mm film as the widest release for that format in 25 years. You know, Nolan, he's a killer for film. He loves that stuff. It was released again in December 2017, presumably for awards bids. The film opened to a box office gross domestically of about $19.8 million, including $5.5 million from pre-release showings. And on the first weekend alone, it's estimated to have grossed more than $50 million in the United States. This was Nolan's fourth largest opening, but the third largest for any World War II film. Dunkirk continued to remain on top of the box office for the next 4 weeks, beating new releases like The Emoji Movie, unsurprisingly, but eventually sort of slipped behind The Dark Tower and Annabelle. But overall, it grossed about $188 million in the US and $337 million in other countries, for a total of about $526 million worldwide, becoming the highest performing World War II film of all time. Upon his release, Dunkirk was universally lauded and complimented for its intricate storytelling and revolutionary take on the survival film genre. It got 92% on Rotten Tomatoes, A- on CinemaScore, 94 out of 100 on Metacritic, and everyone agreed that Nolan's handling of the scale of this production and his idiosyncratic approach to many cinematic conventions sort of really drove this film forward. Many also agreed that it's one of the greatest war movies ever created. I think Washington Post named it one of the 23 movies of the century. For me, watching Dunkirk in the summer of 2017 was the first step in a greater scheme of events that led me to where I am today. It's because of Dunkirk that I'm studying film in school. It's because of Dunkirk that I'm not buried headfirst in readings for my degree in political science or something. Dunkirk released at a very pivotal time in my life. It was the summer before my senior year of high school. I was trying to figure out what to do, didn't really know what was going on, avoiding a lot of work. As I said, I watched about 53 movies that summer. This was one of the films that I genuinely couldn't wait to watch. So when it released, I was there at its first screening at 10:30 a.m. When I saw the trailer for it, I got a glimpse of Hans Zimmer's score and the visuals and the devastating build-up of tension and how all of it came together, and that was just enough to convince me that this was going to be something special. I couldn't wait to watch it. So, with my breakfast popcorn, I sort of gathered my thoughts and braced myself for what to come. It opened with a scene of 6 soldiers walking through the streets of Dunkirk, grasping for water, cigarettes, and whatever could be used as toilet paper, and during their exploration, they come under fire from opposition forces. Now, my original thought was, where's Harry Styles in this? But, he came in later. It's during that scene that Nolan introduces the audience of being on the beach, the experience of being on the beach in Dunkirk in 1942. Watching as Fine Whitehead climbs over fences and runs through a hailstorm of bullets. I was so enamored by the spectacle, but I also knew what I knew about the cardboard cutouts. It just allowed me to appreciate the creative forces and the planning that goes behind making a film. And I understood what it requires to stage something so technically challenging. The film is a testament to the suffering and camaraderie that comes with war, and its hauntingly silent, long and suspenseful scenes, the delicacy with which all the stories intertwine, and the synergy of each little part to create this masterful big picture. Dunkirk managed to convince me that this is where my real passion was. By the time the credits came rolling, I decided that my name would someday be on the credits for a movie. And hopefully, that movie will change someone else's life. I found a sense of power and a new faucet of creativity open with this film, and set off my journey towards the world of cinema and possibly homelessness. Alright, with that, let's take a break here. Stay tuned, because we're going to talk about Alice in Wonderland and my 5 favorite comedy movies on Netflix after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. We've spoken today about Desperados, the worst movie of the 2020s, and Dunkirk, the movie that inspired me to eventually want to become a filmmaker. We're going to talk about one of my childhood favorite movies now, Alice in Wonderland. Now, I want to talk about Alice in Wonderland for a couple of reasons. One, because Alice in Wonderland, the movie, the version I'm talking about is the 1951 original Disney film, not the Tim Burton adaptation from the 2010s, I think, featuring Johnny Depp. One of the reasons is because it's one of my favorite Disney animations, like, of all time. I think might be second or third after Aladdin. Now, Aladdin is my favorite Disney film of all time. And we'll talk about that at some point, I'm sure, because I love Aladdin, and I'm sad about what they did to it. But the other reason is because Alice in Wonderland is a film that I just spoke about on one of my friends' podcasts named A Filmmaker's History. Now, what my friend Matthew is doing is taking the entire filmography of a filmmaker, in this case the Walt Disney Animation Studios, which isn't a particular person, but it is his favorite studio, and he has an affinity for animated films. And he's going through the entire Disney filmography, really, from its origins in Snow White in the 30s, I believe, up to the revival era that we are currently in. Now, I've done a few episodes with Matthew, and you can find his podcast on Spotify. But I wanted to talk about Alice in Wonderland here because it's got a special place in my heart. So, for some background, Alice in Wonderland had always been a passion project for Walt Disney. His first movies before sort of Snow White came to be were these shorts that were a mix of live action and animation called Alice Comedies, based on his first, I think, original short, if I'm not mistaken, called Alice's Wonderland. Now, this isn't entirely based on Alice in Wonderland. It is, however, sort of superficially the same type of premise. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Alice in Wonderland was supposed to be the first Walt Disney full-feature animation, but it kept getting pushed and pushed, and, it was supposed to be originally a live-action animation blend with Mary Pickford, but it got sidelined because of Paramount's Alice in Wonderland project in 1933. It was originally conceived as this blend of live action and animation, the same way Alice's Wonderland was back in the day, but the reaction to Song of the South, Disney's worst movie ever, ultimately killed that. Now, for those of you who don't know what Song of the South is, I suggest you Google it because I feel sick even thinking about it. It just wasn't a good... It wasn't... No. Nothing redeemable about that film. Absolutely horrendous. Anyway, so Alice in Wonderland, based off of Lewis Carroll's book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and Through the Looking Glass, its sequel, is the story of Alice, who's a girl who's bored with her studies, and eventually starts yearning for a world where nothing makes sense. She sees then a white rabbit running, complaining about being late, so already doesn't make sense. And in what has now become common psychedelic lingo, follows the rabbit down the rabbit hole. She eventually shrinks and grows in a game with a doorknob in order to go through the door so that she can continue following the rabbit. She meets Tweedledee and Tweedledum, where she hears the story of the walrus and the carpenter. Now, the walrus and the carpenter story, if you haven't seen it, I had a really weird interpretation of it when I watched it again to do this podcast. First of all, for me, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, as well as the rest of the story, really follow this idea that Alice in Wonderland, for me, is sort of a critique on parenting. Now, a lot of the things that it talks about, a lot of the things that don't make sense are, for me, ultimately what the bottom line of the story is, which is Wonderland is adulthood, and Alice is a child who is forced into adulthood and doesn't understand anything that's going on. The first sort of instance of this is the White Rabbit complaining about being late for something, which is something that I don't know about your parents, but my parents do a lot. But in a sort of more implicit manner, it's a commentary on the structure of adulthood and how everything needs to be done as per schedule in our busy and very often inward-looking lives. We then move on to going down the rabbit hole and into the door, where it seemed like the door was doing what a lot of parents do with their children. They sort of play around until the child gets frustrated and then immediately regret their actions once the tears start falling. We then move on to the Tweedledee and Tweedledum stories, which, in a very George Carlin manner, seem to be a way for the film to sort of critique the art of storytelling and the boogeyman experience that parents often employ in order to get their children to do what they want. They tell her the story of the walrus and the carpenter, which is essentially this walrus goes down and steals a bunch of baby oysters with the intention of eating them, but tells them the story of, I'm going to show you the world and grow up, which by extension is sort of the entirety of Alice in Wonderland. It's a way for Lewis Carroll to tell the audience that maybe don't grow up so fast. We as children spend so much time worried about growing up and how fast adulthood is coming, only to realize when it actually comes, and I'm actually hitting this point at this point, that it's not as good as advertised. Like, sure, you can eat pizza for breakfast, but do you really want to eat pizza for breakfast every day? Like, you have to take responsibility for your actions, and it's something I'm learning for sure, and something that I feel like this book really helps teach. Anyway, continuing. She then, after the encounter with Tweedledee and Tweedledum, goes to the White Rabbit's house, where she is mistaken for his maid. She grows giant again and is attacked as a monster, and then shrinks to 3 inches tall. She goes to the garden of singing flowers. Now, these singing flowers, this was an interesting scene for me because it's really like a sort of metaphor for fitting in, you know. In the beginning, you can enter a group and seem to fit in like she does with these flowers. They start singing about themselves and complimenting each other, but when they realize she's not one of them, she's immediately ostracized. Now that just feels like a very adept social commentary, because who hasn't experienced that? After the garden rejects her because she's a human, or as the flowers see her, a weed, she meets the caterpillar, who, after a series of riddling questions and introspection, which is essentially where I see most of the drug references that make this movie so popular among the that made this movie so popular among the 60s psychedelic movement. She then eats mushrooms that help her grow. See, what's interesting here is this movie came out in 1951, and psychedelic mushrooms weren't actually a thing until 1955. So that, while it doesn't add up, there just does seem to be a little bit of a sort of clairvoyant message there. She eventually then moves on to meet the famed Cheshire Cat, who advises her to go to the Mad Hatter and the March Hare. Now, this is one of the most famous sort of scenes, but you know what's interesting is the Mad Hatter, who's very popular, like very common and has a lot of screen time in the Tim Burton version of the film, is not as big in this film, and I assume that's because they didn't have to pay Johnny Depp for it. That's just how it is. If you pay Johnny Depp for a film, especially when it's Tim Burton's film, who Johnny Depp is such a frequent collaborator of, you're gonna have to feature him a lot. But in some ways, I really enjoyed this scene a lot more than some of Johnny Depp's performances in the remake. I think one of the things that made this great was when they recorded this scene, they had a live version of all of the characters sitting down and performing everything the same way in a studio. And they used the sound from that live enactment of the scene in the film. You know, they tried to do it in a way that was individually recorded as they would normally, but it just didn't seem to be as funny. And honestly, I'm glad they did, because that is one of the most incredibly fast-paced scenes I've ever seen. And it's so funny. They celebrate their unbirthdays there, which is basically every day that your birthday is, and which I feel like we should celebrate. That's a beautiful message that goes back to the original thing that I was talking about. We take ourselves so seriously that we look forward to one day in the year where we can celebrate ourselves. We should be celebrating every day. At this point, the White Rabbit's pocket watch is destroyed by the Mad Hatter, and Alice, who's fed up by the nonsense, escapes to cry on a rock. For me, this feels like the lowest point of the film, the ego death, per se, in psychedelic terms. But this is where the Cheshire Cat reappears and tells her to go to the Queen of Hearts. Now, in a completely absurd series of events, the Queen of Hearts believes that Alice messes up her game of croquet, which in fact the Cheshire Cat did. And Alice goes through a very weird trial where the sentence is passed before the verdict. And then in order to escape her fate of beheading, she runs away from a deck of cards and approaches the door from the beginning. She asks the door to let her out, but the door says, "You've been asleep the whole time." She looks through the keyhole and realizes that she's been asleep. She wakes up, tries to explain the dream to her mother, and then goes for tea. This film didn't perform very well in the beginning when it first premiered in London. And it received a lukewarm reception. But in the 60s, along with Dumbo, when it became one of Disney's first VHS releases, and Dumbo, again, is a movie full of psychedelic references, it was revamped. Now, at this time, a lot of the ways to only watch films were to go back to the cinema because they didn't have very developed home entertainment technologies. So they would release films every 7 years. And this way, Alice in Wonderland sort of regained popularity every time it was re-released. Another thing was that the fans of the book really, really disliked this film because it had nothing to do with the original because it was, in their words, a gross perversion of the original text material. It wasn't faithful to Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, in that it combined both books and their elements to sort of create its own story. But, it worked for me. At the end of the day, the film has a special place in my heart because it's one of the first Disney movies I ever watched, but also one of the most interesting films every time I watch it again. And if you haven't seen it already, or if you saw it a very long time, I suggest going into a deep dive of Disney films from the 50s. A lot of the stuff that we grew up on, The Lion King, Aladdin, Princess and the Frog, these are very new forms of Disney movies with very different sort of ideologies behind them. And it's worth going back to explore the difference in filmmaking, especially when Walt Disney himself had input into these early films. Alright, with that, let's take a break. Stay tuned because up next we're going to talk about my 5 favorite comedies on Netflix.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
And welcome back. So just to close off the show, I want to talk about some of the comedies that I watch on Netflix. My favorite comedies on Netflix. So I want to start off with probably my favorite comedy on Netflix, You Don't Mess with the Zohan. Now, Adam Sandler, his comedy, this film, it's sort of a way, it's shameless approach to get every single laugh possible. It's like a hymn to vulgarity, and either you enjoy it or you don't. Sandler plays this ace agent for the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, as a counterterrorism specialist, and the best one the Mossad has. He spends as much time hanging out with attractive women on the beach and eating as much hummus as possible. The Zohan has these remarkable physical skills, and he can do pretty much anything. The laws of gravity don't apply to him. He's basically Spider-Man with very apparent junk. But the Zohan has one secret desire. He wants to be a hairdresser. His dream is to work for the Paul Mitchell salon. And one day he simply smuggles himself out of Israel and into the US carrying 2 dogs whose hair he cuts. And in America, he sort of goes after that dream, because that's what America is, right? The land of the dreams. He changes his name to Scrappy Coco, auditions for a bunch of hair salons, until he's finally hired by Dalia, a Palestinian. And that's where the drama begins. Now, Zohan, as a sort of political comedy to do with the Israeli-Palestine conflict, which is one of the most terrible things happening in the world, should be offensive. But the intent of the film is so sincere that it just seems foolish to suggest that there's any notion of politicization in this film. You know, Rob Schneider plays a Middle Eastern taxi driver in this. And to even sort of help smooth the tensions, Sandler brings together the Israeli and Palestinian diasporas against the capitalist, white supremacist Americans at the end. I think this is probably one of the funniest movies I've ever seen featuring Adam Sandler. And definitely one of my favorite movies growing up. Next up is Groundhog Day, the Bill Murray classic. Now, the most horrific thing about life is we don't know what's going to happen next, and that's pretty much the subtext behind this film. Harold Ramis, the director, he made this incredibly funny but deeply spiritual film about knowing exactly what's going to happen next and the deep, dark consequences of it. Now it's a movie that ultimately brings together such a very beautiful spiritual concept of repetition to Bill Murray and his incredible performance. Bill Murray plays the most bitter and cynical weatherman in the world, Phil Connors, and it follows him as he makes his annual trip to Punxsutawney, I think that's how you pronounce it, to cover Groundhog Day. But once they get snowed in, he wakes up to Groundhog Day again and again, and that's the movie. What amazes me about this film is that Murray and Ramis get away with it. There's not a single moment in this film that either of them lose their nerve or the tone is broken. You know, Phil undergoes this huge transformation, but never loses his edge. And the movie doesn't get soapy at the end, because that's what life is like. You know, tomorrow will always come, and whether or not it's the same day as today, all we can do about it is be the best person we can be. And that's what the film is about. It's about the good news that we can learn to be better people every day. The third film, and this film I'm sure most of you probably aren't necessarily very familiar with, is one of my favorite Hindi thriller comedy to come out in the last few years. It's called Andhadhun, which basically means blind tune. It's an official adaptation of a French short film called The Piano Tuner. Andhadhun is set in Pune, where Akash, a piano player pretending to be blind, meets Sophie, who gives him a break to play at at her father's restaurant. At this restaurant, an old washed-up actor invites him, having been inspired by the blind pianist, to his house so that he can play for his wife's birthday. Upon reaching the house, Akash, the blind pianist, finds that the actor is dead, but because he is blind, pretends to be unaware of the things around. But things get complicated when the actor's wife, Simi, suspects that Akash isn't really blind. Now it's difficult to go on without giving more spoilers, so I won't talk about the plot anymore. But at this point, the story really starts to get going, and it never really stops. Even though it does get complicated towards the end, there's so much to this film. There's chase sequences, doctors, organ transplants, rabbits eating cabbages. All of this makes such a complex but beautiful story. And it's great fun. And the cast knows it. Both the lead actors, Ayushmann Khurrana, who plays Akash, and Tabu, who plays Simi, are incredible. Tabu is one of the best actors to come out of the Hindi film industry. And she goes from shy to vulnerable to ruthless in seconds. This is one of her probably most memorable roles, and one of the roles that solidified Khurrana as a bona fide leading man in the Hindi film industry. My third pick is The Lobster, which is the English language debut from Greek director Yorgos Lanthimos, most famously known for his recent picture The Favourite, starring Emma Stone. You know, in this film, he creates this dystopian world where being single is an act of crime. A romantic breakup thrusts any single person into the darkness of society's outside. Like any good satire, The Lobster knows how to tiptoe the line between realism and poking fun at the audience. In this situation, any single person has 45 days after they break up with a partner to find a new one. And if they don't find a new partner, they will be turned into an animal. The message here is clear, that couples deserve all the protections and single people don't. The Lobster is such a smart satire that it plays with its own rules and doesn't ever sort of openly show that it is. It's extremely funny, but at the same time bleak and ruthless. You know, for a love story, the film is cold, it's artificial, and so are the characters. But it still dares the viewers to be invested in what's going on. At the end, it's unclear if anyone's actually learned anything, but that's what makes it such a cynical look at what society is and the structures that sort of guide us and love. It's just beyond any other comedy and satire that I've seen. This story isn't willing to settle for a happy ever after. It has to make its point. And finally, this film, The Family. Now, The Family follows a family in the witness protection program, where the Manzioni family gets to live in a quaint house in a tiny village in Normandy, with FBI guys across the street in another house and a personal hander to make sure they're safe. The point of the family being in Normandy is to pass as Americans on holiday, but what fails this mission is the fact that they're all raging maniacs. So this film follows Giovanni Manzoni, played by Robert De Niro, who snitched on his mafia friends back in the States. And now, because there's a $20 million bounty on his head, in exchange for his testimony, he and his family, his wife played by Michelle Pfeiffer, and 2 teenage kids, are placed in witness protection program under the control and watchful eye of an FBI agent played by Tommy Lee Jones. Now, one of the reasons this is so good is that it's a stacked cast. You know, Robert De Niro and Michelle Pfeiffer have played characters like this for so long, it's like second nature to them. But one of the best things, and if you must watch this film, watch it for Robert De Niro delivering a dissertation on Robert De Niro in Goodfellas as Robert De Niro as Giovanni Manzoni. It's the most incredible meta bit, and it makes the entire film. Now, the reason I wanted to do top 5 comedy films is because I love comedy. And I feel like comedy and humor is just the best vehicle for films to sort of deliver a message or just to entertain. You know, in the case of Zohan, it was definitely the latter. But in the case of The Lobster, you get this hard-hitting social commentary. And I just love the versatility and sort of the way comedy fits into our society in every single way and can plug at every need. But with that, I want to thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh Nanda, and I'm probably going to awkwardly close out every episode until I can figure out my Ron Burgundy closing line. So you stay classy, San Diego.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.